All right, so moving on now to Steiner's next set of lectures. In order to follow these chronologically, you have to skip over to Karmic Relationships, Volume 5, which is where the trail picks up, the chronological trail. And the first three lectures are a bit rambling. He's kind of all over the place. But one thing I do want to point out before we get into the past lives, and the past lives in this video will be Ernst Haeckel and once again Francis Bacon and another individual that we'll get into. So he talks about what happens to the soul after it leaves the body when it dies, and it goes through the gate of the moon, the gate of death, but it's basically the moon gate, where the beings who live in the moon can read the astral body and store up those karmic memories. And then when the individual reincarnates and has to pass back through the moon gate, which is the closest of the gates to the earth, they re-imprint that karma back onto the individual. So what happens is that the individual passes through that moon gate with the etheric body, the astral body, and the ego. But the etheric body doesn't last very long. It's something like 3 days, and it slowly disintegrates. But as it disintegrates and separates into this astral space, what Steiner calls akasha, which the Hindus, that's the word that they use for space. It's a kind of, it's not empty space, it's living space, it's alive. One's life review takes place. One sees, one is one's own judge, and one sees what happened, and whether one is affected or disaffected, or how one treated other people and so forth. You see all of that, and that happens very quickly. That's really the first thing that takes place once the soul gets to the other side. But we have these hierarchies of the angels, and we don't have to use the word angels. Keep that in mind. Sri Aurobindo calls them devas. The words don't matter. These are just higher beings. And according to Steiner, there are these three ranks of them, just as on the earthly plane, the human is the highest of the ranks of the animal, plant, and mineral worlds. So here we have three ranks going above, 3 times 3 in 3 rows, going above the human. The human on the physical plane is at the peak. On the other side, however, the human is the lowest spiritual being out of all the other beings. And so for the beings of the third hierarchy, which are the ones in this bottom row here that are the ones that are the closest to the human, we have angels, archangels, and Steiner changes the name principalities to archai. They're time spirits. They have to do with zeitgeist events. But these angels, when one gets to the other side, these are the beings that have to do with one's personality and disposition. He doesn't elaborate that much about that. That's all he says. And then, though, we get to the middle rank here, the dominions, powers, and virtues, or what he calls the exousiae, dynamis, and kyriotets. Those angels have to do with what will be bestowed on the individual as talents for the next incarnation. And I would presume that this would have something to do with the planets and their arrangement, because in an astrological reading, when you read someone's birth chart, the planets tell what the person's talents are. So it must have something to do with this middle hierarchy here. And then the top hierarchy are the most powerful ones, the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. He keeps those names. Those are the ones that really have to do with the working out of your karma. They are the ones who work with you, show you what you did to people, where you were compassionate, where you were an asshole. They show you what you did, and they will show you what the karmic consequences of your actions are going to be in your next life. The way you treated people in your next life is the way you're going to be treated the next time. He says if you give Yeah, he has this interesting idea where he's talking about, let's see if I can find it, where he's talking about, like he says, 3 different lifetimes in a row. He says, in one lifetime, if an individual is loving, and then in the next lifetime, that individual will experience joy. Joy will come easily to that individual. And then in the next lifetime after that, an understanding of the world and an interest of the world will come easily to that individual. Think of someone like Goethe, for whom everything was fascinating. So he must have had a couple of good previous lifetimes. And I think at some point in this series, he'll get to Goethe. I can't wait for that. On the other hand, hatred, and we all experience all of these emotions, of course, so you can't just simplify it. But there are certain individuals in which, let's say, hatred predominates, and then that is transformed in the subsequent lifetime into a hypersensitivity to suffering. So that individual will suffer a lot more if the previous lifetime had been based primarily on hatred. And I've known a few of these individuals who just hate, and only hate. And it's like the only emotion they can experience. In the next lifetime, they're going to suffer. They're going to have a hypersensitivity to suffering. And then the lifetime following that, there will be obtuseness and a lack of understanding of the world. They'll just be an individual who takes no delight or interest in anything. And we know such dimwits. They're pretty common. So that's the way the karma works. All right, so let's get to the examples of the past lives here. First of Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was a 19th century German biologist, probably the 3rd most important theoretician of evolution after Darwin and Thomas Huxley. And Haeckel met Darwin. Darwin was still alive, and Haeckel met him on the Canary Islands. That must have been quite a thrill for the two of them. Haeckel's dates are 1834 to 1919. He was a total materialist, and he was single-handedly responsible for carrying the theory of evolution into Germany, the wrong theory of evolution, the Darwinian version of it, into Germany. The Germans already had an understanding of evolution, starting with Goethe, which was the correct version of it, that evolution occurs in leaps and jumps. Mutation theory is the primary thing. Whereas with Haeckel and Darwin, there shouldn't be any transitions. And so Haeckel very dishonestly, he hit the problem. And I brought this problem up in my Sri Aurobindo lectures, that when you have the transition from non-living matter, let's say the mineral world, to the living world of bacteria, there's a leap there. There's a jump. There's no intermediate forms, because now you have souls incarnating in matter at that point. In the Archean eon, when life first appears about, it's still debated, 3.5 billion years ago, something like that. Now you're getting souls that are incarnating in matter that has been rarefied and ready to go. But Haeckel invented these strange organisms, these monera, that are totally fictitious, that are half material, half living. I should have pulled up some diagrams of these fraudulent creatures, because the Darwinian dogma is that there are no transitional forms are always there. They'll just be found eventually. Of course, they never have been, because there aren't transitional forms, because life is thought out on the other side, on the astral plane first, where it occurs as an idea to some angel or spirit being. Then it incarnates as a physical being. So there are lots of gaps that are, of course, never going to be filled. But Haeckel believed that, along with Darwin, that the gaps would be filled. And so he created all these fictitious transitional creatures that don't exist and never have existed. A speechless man-ape, for instance, to bridge the gap between apes and men. All this ridiculous stuff. But the thing to think about with regard to Haeckel is his diatribes against the church, especially the Catholic Church and especially the Jesuits. He really hated the church, and the church, of course, attacked his doctrines, and they went back and forth. There's a book that Haeckel wrote about how the Jesuits have gotten everything wrong. So it's anti-Catholicism with this guy all the way. So, irony of ironies, when Steiner investigates his past life, we find out that he was Pope Gregory VII, also known as originally Cardinal Hildebrandt. That was his original name. And let's see, his dates were 1015 to 1085. And this individual was as much a zealot of Catholicism and the proper way to be a priest as Haeckel was a zealot of Darwinian evolution. They both had the same zealotry and the same persecution of non-believers. And so this guy wanted to reform the papacy, really come down strong on keeping with the celibacy idea, because a lot of the priests weren't. And he wrote a document in 1075 called the Dictatus Papi, in which he asserted his power and the power of the Pope over the emperor, over the king. And he went to war with Henry IV. So let's take a look for a second at the main points of the doctrine here. Here's a YouTube video about Pope Gregory VII. Only the Pope can with right be called universal. All princes shall kiss the feet of the Pope alone. It may be permitted to him to depose emperors. He himself may be judged by no one. The Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err, to all eternity, Scripture being witness. The Roman pontiff, if he has been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made holy by the merits of St. Peter. Ho, ho, ho! Well, yeah. Sure, right. And Henry IV, of course, did not accept this, and they actually went to physical war over this. Henry IV stormed Rome with an army, went in, and Pope Gregory had to hole himself up in a fortress, and he called in the Normans. Remember, this is the period of the Norman invasion of England. That's 1066. And so the Normans come, led by Robert Guiscard. I think the poet Kleist has a play about Robert Guiscard. So he's leading the Normans, and they come into Rome on the side of the Pope, and they fight against the English troops, and more or less prevail, except that what happens is when you invited an army in, the blowback effect. The Normans started tearing Rome to pieces, raping, pillaging, putting people to the sword, and Pope Gregory had to leave, and within 1 year he was dead. He was in exile, and he was dead. He got exactly what he deserved, as far as I'm concerned. All right, so that is Haeckel's past life as Pope Gregory VII. And you can see the zealotry in both cases, the fierceness with which they defend Catholicism on the one hand, asserting the power of the Pope over the emperor on the one hand, and then when Haeckel reincarnates in the 19th century as a materialist, the zealotry with which he defends that doctrine. You can see that. All right, so now let's take a look. Let's go back to Francis Bacon. We've already mentioned that Harun al-Rashid was the reincarnation of Francis Bacon. Harun al-Rashid was incredibly sophisticated in Baghdad about the time of Charlemagne, around 800, and had surrounding him this court of mathematicians, astrologers, geometers, you name it. Al-Khwarizmi, I believe, wrote the algebra treatise, all surrounding him in this court. And so he reincarnates as Francis Bacon, and Francis Bacon basically introduces the scientific method, especially of induction. And the difference with induction and deduction is that deduction begins with general principles. It moves from the general to the specific, whereas induction begins with the study of individual cases, and then you gradually induce general principles from the study and contrast of these individual cases. So he's inventing the scientific method. And he also invents the idea of the experiment. A scientist should, a natural philosopher, as they would have been called back then, should be able to conduct an experiment, write it down and record it such that it can be repeated by future natural philosophers. So he basically invents the scientific method. That's the key thing to keep in mind about Francis Bacon. Now, in the court of Harun al-Rashid, there was an unnamed individual, we don't know who his name is according to Steiner, who was Harun al-Rashid's right-hand man. He was the guy, he was the John Dee, let's say, of the court of Baghdad. As John Dee was to Queen Elizabeth, so was this guy, whoever he was, to Harun al-Rashid. So they reincarnated at about the same time, and this guy turns up as Amos Comenius. Now, Amos Comenius is the inventor of modern education. He was a bishop. Unlike Francis Bacon, he was religious. He was part of the church. He was a bishop. But he invented this idea of pan-Sophism, which means that everyone should have access to education, including children and women. He invented the idea of having textbooks with pictures in them, written in the vernacular language, not Latin, so that anyone could understand them. The complete inventor of modern education, Amos Comenius. So both of these guys who were together at the court in Baghdad reincarnate separately, and this guy was born in Moravia, which back then was Slovenia, I believe. So far southeastern Europe, kind of in the Croatian zone. And so he comes into the east as Bacon, as Harun, as al-Rashid incarnates as Bacon in the west. And Bacon's scientific method spreads from west to east as Comenius's modern theory of education spreads up from southeastern Europe and goes north. And where the two meet is where modernity begins. This, by the way, both of these guys are contemporaries with John Dee. So I'm wondering, given that mediums have told me that I'm the reincarnation of John Dee, if as we read through Karmic Relationships, he ever has anything to say about John Dee, I'll be very interested to see that. All right, there you have it. There's that chapter, guys.